my doctor tells me that I don't drink enough water, so I was asking around for water, and the lovely man in the sound booth gave me this tin of Dutch water, so let's hear it for the sound man. And please remind me to drink throughout this, I do forget. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you, everybody. All that stands between you and your beers now is 132 slides, so let's crack on. My name's Nick. I'm a futures designer, and that's not a term that very many people know or many people use. And essentially what it means is I use design as a tool to help explore the future and to bring it into sort of stark, vivid reality. And I've been really fortunate that I've been able to do that for some quite interesting companies. I spent a lot of time working with Sony, helping them explore the types of things they might make in the future, helping them explore beyond the things they were making at the time. I also worked for a really brilliant team at Nokia. Who remembers Nokia? Trying to figure out if it had a future in cameras, and if it did have a future in cameras, what that might look like. As was mentioned, I was most recently head of design at Google X, and this is Google X. And this is the place where Google makes some of its biggest bets about the future and then works really hard to try and make those bets into a reality. And you might be most familiar with Google X for projects like this. This was Waymo, which was one of our first graduates in 2016, and this was a self-driving car project. We also worked on this project called Loon, which was where we were using balloons to suspend the internet from places above the planet that needed it but couldn't get it. And also I spent a great deal of time thinking about robots, thinking about robotics and how they might find a meaningful place in our lives and become sort of more integrated into the ways in which we live our lives and how they might operate alongside people in our homes and in our workplaces. And a lot of this work involves working quite closely with scientists and engineers and technologies and inventors and people who are developing these new nascent technologies. And a lot of my job in working with these types of techniques is to think beyond what it is or what it might be or even what it does and try to think a bit more about what it might mean. And that means finding what I call the grain in a technology. So if you're working with any material like these nice fellas making bentwood chairs, you have to find out the directionality of a material. You have to find out where it wants to go and work with it. So if you try and work against it, in this case, it'll all splinter and break and you won't make very good chairs. And that's the kind of thing I want to explore today. And just like a billion people all around the world, I'm going to be on this stage talking about artificial intelligence today. But before we do that, I'd like to go back quite a long way, back to 1929. This is actually Amsterdam in 1929. And we're in between the world wars. It's the end of the Roaring '20s, and the Great Depression is just around the corner. And in America, this small company called Vega invented this. And this is the world's first portable guitar amplifier. This little wooden box of a thing, a handle on top. And the way an amplifier works, I hope you can see my diagram, is quite simple. It takes an input from a vibrating string, in this case, through a mechanical pickup, and it feeds it into an electrical circuit, which increases the amplitude, hence amplifier. And when you increase the amplitude, the sound gets louder. But that's not the end of the story, because you can turn it up too high. And when you turn it up too high, the top and the bottom of the curve gets clipped off, and you end up with this sort of crackling, bubbling, snarly sort of sound that's mostly known as distortion. And then what happened, in this case, was a lot of electrical engineers said, we want to try and get rid of that. We want to try and smooth that out. We want to try and improve the capabilities of our amplifiers and make them better and better and better, based on an assumption of the purpose of these amplifiers. And so for the next 100 years, sound engineers and technologists set about trying to do that, and that continues to this day. You know, people trying to make better and better amplifiers on this quest for sort of idealized sound performance somehow, aiming for higher and higher fidelity, which is where we get hi-fi from, high fidelity. But if we really think about how amplifiers and amplified music really changed the world, we see something slightly different. So if we go back now, this is 1949. This is the Fender Deluxe, and they call it a TV front amplifier because it looks a bit like an old TV screen. And when amplifiers like this came out, more and more people started to use them, and they started to play with them a bit. And they heard something sort of provocative and interesting in the sounds that came out of these boxes. This wonderful man is Jackie Brenston, and he was recording tracks in 1951, and the guitarist in his band, he turned the amplifier way up, and it gave all these sort of weird, snarly, growly, sort of distorted sounds, but they kind of liked it. So they recorded a song, and that song was called Rocket 88. And when it was released on March the 3rd of that year, it became the first song in a genre we called rock and roll. So, by 1955, Chuck Berry was playing with the same sorts of techniques, and he was recording songs like Maybelline. And this warm, distorted, overdriven sort of sound became a defining part of the genre of rock and roll. Who knows who this is? This is Link Wray. Link Wray produced a song called Rumble, in which he used this really heavily distorted guitar sound to great effect, and it really whipped the conservative radio DJs of the time into a bit of a frenzy, and the song was actually banned on the radio, and it has no lyrics. It's an instrumental track, and it's the only instrumental track ever to be banned on American radio. And of course, the rest is history after this. 1970s took that sound, and they drove it even harder. You ended up with heavy metal, and bands like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple. 1970s came along, which is when I came along. Bands like the Sex Pistols and the punk generation started to play with this sound even more, making harsher and more distorted sounds. And then the hardcore scene in Washington, D.C. in the 80s, and then grunge in the 90s, and the rest kind of writes itself, right? All of this is a direct result of people leaning in to that problematic distortion. We can look elsewhere as well. This is Robert Moog. So in 1964, he demonstrated a prototype for what he called, I'll have to read this, his voltage-controlled electronic music module, a synthesized instrument. And it was very technically amazing for its time, and even so, the sounds that it produced were a little bit weird and didn't really sound like the instruments he was trying to make. They were a bit funny and a bit tinny, and they didn't sound like the things that he was trying to mimic. And this also is Tadao Kikumoto, who was working for Roland in the 1970s. And he was trying to make realistic percussion sounds, but the chips that he needed, these memory chips, they were just way too expensive for him to use. So he had to use transistors. And when you use transistors, you get a really weird fizzy sound, which is not quite what he was going for. But if we look at these instruments, a bunch of creative people got hold of Bob Moog's synthesized keyboards, and they started to integrate them into their bands, exploring what they actually were rather than what they hoped they would be. So the Moog synthesizer was adopted by bands like The Doors and the Rolling Stones and even the Beatles. And anyone that knows anything about music knows the result of Kikumoto's work. This was the Roland 808 drum machine. Yeah, right. Most of the noises in the 808, they don't sound like real instruments at all. They are their own thing. They sound a bit weird. But without the 808, we wouldn't have Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing. We wouldn't have Rock the Bells by LL Cool J. And we wouldn't have Planet Rock. So we take it for granted today. But these alien, synthetic, overdriven, distortion-laden, artifact-laden sounds, they dominate our musical landscape. From ambient house to techno, to jungle, to rap, to pop, they all feature these strange, overblown sounds. So I should probably start talking about artificial intelligence, as I promised. The term artificial intelligence actually encompasses a lot of things, and I think a lot of people are either too scared or they don't really want to ask what it really means, and what I want to do is just quickly step through what we mean when we say AI. So, I did an animation. All AI starts with a little computational unit called a node. That's like a little synapse in your brain. And these nodes are arranged, more animation, into layers. So in these layers, you might have a few nodes in a layer, or there may be many thousands of these things in one layer. And then you get an output layer. So you have two of these layers stacked up on top of each other, input layer, output layer. And in between all these layers might be a large number of hidden layers. So in something like GPT-3 from OpenAI, there are 96 of these hidden layers making a huge sort of stacked wedding cake. And that whole stack is known as a neural network. And if it has more than two of these hidden layers, we call it a deep neural network. So that's the first complicated bit. The second is training data, and that might be many types of things, and it can consist of many millions of pieces of data, from images and text to computer code to music, and all of that is then fed into this system in a process we call machine learning. Once that process is complete, this whole thing we call a model, and the model is the sort of underlying product of what these companies are trying to sell. So Claude from Anthropic, or Gemini from Google, or GPT-4 from OpenAI, they are all models. And that's the sort of thing they're trying to sell to each other. And what makes these interesting is then you can apply them to novel problems. So you can show it a picture of a cat, and it says, this is a cat. And that makes them incredibly useful. But the reason I've stepped through all of that is you can see how many different pieces these systems are made up from, and how many moments and how many events they have to go through to come into existence. And of course, with any very, very complicated machine, there are hundreds of points of potential failure. Hundreds of times when things might go wrong, the data might be badly labeled, the system might not quite understand what we're asking of it. And our response as a sort of technical community is to try and iron out those errors. Just like those audio engineers I mentioned earlier, we're trying to smooth out these things to get to some performance benchmark. And we measure all of our systems and our products against these benchmarks. But this stems from an assumption of what we think these things are for. I think what we're thinking about when we think about AI at the moment is we're thinking about it as sort of like a technology lubricant, trying to do what we already do, but just faster or cheaper or quicker or more efficient. And that's honestly because the conversation about AI is dominated by our technologists, our investors, and the thirsty crowd on LinkedIn. And there might be something in that. I can totally admit there are plenty of applications for artificial intelligence that are staggering and mind-blowing, and they have to be well engineered for us to trust them. I get that. But I think in order for us to go somewhere genuinely new, we might need some slightly different sort of people. I think we need people like this. So this is Ross Goodwin. And I met Ross Goodwin in Washington, D.C. in 2016. And he is a gloriously strange man. He's a sort of hybrid of a poet and an engineer and a scientist. And what he did in 2016 was he trained a little nascent AI system on science fiction scripts and asked it to create a new science fiction movie script, which of course it did. And it's gloriously weird. It looks like a script, it's formatted like a script, but if you actually read it, it's very, very odd. But the best thing ever is that Ross actually filmed it. He gave it to actors, Thomas Middleditch, Elizabeth Gray, and Humphrey Kerr, and said, act this out. And it is all over the place weird. It is full of odd little moments of dialogue and interactions between people. It's called Sunspring. If you get a chance, it's a very short movie, but you should really watch it. This next project is lovely too. This is a chap called James Bridle, who's a brilliantly creative person. And he found a stack of wood in his house. And he described that stack of wood to an AI product. Said, this is what I've got. And can you help me turn it into a chair? So the results came back. This is what I think you should do. And again, the best thing about James is he made the chair. And it's this sort of strange, disproportional product, right? It looks like something a human wouldn't have drawn. It looks like something we wouldn't have designed as our species. So even if we just play with words, those sort of simple distortionary nuances that come with language can make us sort of, take us into sort of interesting, weird, messed up sort of territory. But if we get into images, things get even more interesting. So perhaps one of the more important moments in our recent AI history came in 2004, which is when Ian Goodfellow introduced us to GANs, generative adversarial networks. So basically a GAN is like you have two pieces. One generates an image and the other judges it, and they sort of war each other upwards. They battle each other, hence adversarial. More recently, midway through 2020, we came across diffusion models. And these are a really interesting way of being able to generate high-quality images from essentially random noise. And products like DALL-E and Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, which many of you may know, they all use these diffusion models. And they're really, really powerful. They can generate these sort of hyper-realistic images and illustrations and photographs or seeming photographs of things that we experience in our lives. But we have to remember they're driven by text. They're driven by prompts. And text is a strange sort of thing because it's been weathered by millennia of slang and misunderstanding and misreading and invention and all these other things. So if we go to one of these tools and we have an image like this in our minds, we want our AI tool to make this thing. So we go to Midjourney and we say a tall yellow crane towering over a city, and we get this. Because of course a crane is also a bird, right? It's a piece of industrial equipment, but it's also a bird. And this is the visual equivalent of like a double entendre. And I know that might be frustrating when we use these tools, but I find it really enticing. And our response is to get ever more convoluted with our prompts. We have prompt engineers. We're trying to add more and more detail to our specification to this machine to try and bend it into our will, to make it do what we want it to do. And we create these sort of odd incantations like magical spells that don't really make sense, but we hope they make sense to the computer. And we get into this weird back and forth where it's like, it's not quite what I wanted. Could we change this a bit? Could we change that a bit? And I've started to call this negotiation computing, which I think is actually something new. It's a million miles away from our kind of vector-based, command-driven, binary systems that we've been used to with computing and the way we operate with computers. And I think it's an uncertainty that I quite like, and I feel like it's genuinely new. Now, of course, these systems make mistakes. They make mistakes. I hope you can see the red ring around the extra digit there. And they've become something that's a little bit maybe famous or infamous in generative AI, and we sort of point at these things and we laugh at them. We say, ha, this is proof that the system is not as good as they say it is, or we're still better than these systems. But I think that might be missing the point a little bit, because I think they offer us a really interesting way to rethink our image culture. Some artists are starting to lean into these tools, and they're starting to use them to help us critique what we think is beautiful or normal or ugly or real. And I think these distortions are offering us new ways of seeing, honestly. They're holding up our canon of artworks to this sort of digital hall of mirrors and saying, what do you think? And they create these fantastical, sometimes unsettling compositions which feel familiar but somehow new, and I think they push us in a new aesthetic direction. These kind of works, they embrace the gaps between these verbal prompts, and they create these often weird and haunting images, but again, I find them endlessly provocative, and if you really lean into these things and look at them for what they are, they take us in new directions. These two fellas I'm lucky enough to call friends. This is Simone and Matteo, and they've lent into these visual distortions in a beautiful way. So they worked with images too. They trained a small AI system on a bunch of images of spoons. They said, this is what a spoon looks like. Can you please generate me 3 illustrations of spoons? Which of course it did. And from there they selected their favorite designs, and they hired one of the best cutlers in Italy to produce these things. And there they are. And I find them endlessly beautiful. They are undoubtedly spoons, and we know them as spoons, but they have these weird asymmetries and these weird bulges and weird distortions that I just don't think any of us would have drawn. Look at that fella, my lovely dad. These AI tools obviously are finding their way very, very quickly into most of our tools. And I think this can open us all up to sort of interesting avenues of exploration if we're open to it. So this is me and my wonderful dad in Toronto. And it's cropped square because Instagram. So I can drop it into Photoshop, and I can say, can you make some more content so it'll fit my slides? And of course it does. And it's pretty impressive. You know, the creases on my shirt are carrying on. The blurred brick in the background is sort of interesting. The distortions in the lens look about right. It's pretty impressive. But what it did do, if you look down in the bottom here, is it added somebody. And I get to thinking, like, who is that person? Why are they there? What are they doing? What's their name? Why were they hiding behind my dad and me? And so we can go into Midjourney and we can start to up-res that like in the movies. And there we go. We're a bit zoomed in on her face, so let's make a bit more content and zoom out, and there we go. So this was that woman that was in Toronto on that day. But I still want to know who she is and what's her story, so of course we go to ChatGPT and said, who is this and what's her story? And then bingo, here we go. She's Sam Turner. She's an investigative journalist who was investigating a huge corruption scandal, it turns out. If only we'd known, we could have turned around and talked to her. Now, obviously this is a simple exercise, but I want to make the point that this creative vector, this sort of narrative exploration, began in Photoshop, a place which we would never assume this kind of story might start, but it can now. So if we move on from images, obviously we get to video. This is the output of a simple consumer product called Runway, and it moves between still frames in this weird, sort of ugly, uncomfortable way. And to me, this just feels like the visual equivalent of a distorted amplifier. It feels like we've turned the system up too high and it's struggling to keep up, and it's sort of doing its best. You might be familiar with this video that did the rounds a while ago of Will Smith eating spaghetti. And everybody used this, and everyone shared it on Threads and wherever else, saying, haha, look, these systems are awful, they're terrible. And I think, again, that's slightly missing the point, because this looks like something we haven't actually seen before. And we can mock it, and we can take the mickey out of it, but it is something new. And again, the response of our technical community and a lot of the people I work with is to try and make these videos somehow better. And they have their own canonical idea of what better means. It means tracking the fidelity, tracking objects, making sure it moves between frames in an effective way. And of course, there's use for that. But we end up in a place like this. So this is Sora from OpenAI, which is their video creation tool. And technically, it's considerably better than that Will Smith clip that I showed you. And I can see countless uses for this type of technique. It starts with a goal of photorealistic video, and it achieves that goal really well. But it does feel quite dry. It does feel like a regurgitation of our existing image and video culture, just the same sort of stuff, but done by a machine. I don't think it pushes us anywhere particularly interesting in any meaningful way. It's toolifying this art form. I like this stuff more. This is a group of people who made a Starbucks advert off existing Starbucks adverts, and they trained the AI to build, a little movie showing what a Starbucks advert is. And it's got all these strange distortions and these weird pieces of movement and these strange artifacts. And you may have recognized on the right-hand side is Ariana Grande, because in the training data, there were lots of images that were labeled with the term grande, because coffee. So I find this stuff endlessly provocative. I find it way more interesting and way more it teases something out of me in a way that Sora video just doesn't. And artists like Mario Klingerman are really experimenting with this at really high fidelity, this strange type of transition. And again, it's something that we haven't really seen in our moving image culture. Frank Manzano as well is also experimenting with this type of technique, and his creations are both sort of disturbing and wonderful at the same time, and they feel like strange new expressions, and they pull and they tug at our understanding of 2D and 3D space. And look at this. This is Kent Hill, and I just love what happens in my brain as it tries to make sense of what's going on here. My brain wants to understand these three-dimensional things. It wants to understand how we get from one to the next, because I live in an object-oriented world, and I live in a three-dimensional world, and yet this is projecting it back to me in a really strange and wonderfully distorted way. But I think this kind of work is fragile, because our world is always bound by conventions, and no matter how free we think we're being with our creativity, we all struggle to escape from these rules that are put in place. Countless people will tell us that some sort of canonical truth, some formula we're supposed to follow to get to the best possible, better outcome. But every now and then somebody comes along and does something like this. In every society, I think there are people who are willing to play and to explore and experiment with their tools and sort of push back on these rules and these structures. And the people that push mediums into new territories are typically not the people who write strategy documents. They're not the people that make venture investments, and they're not really even the people that make the technology themselves. When a new technology emerges, it's the people like designers and writers and artists and musicians. They play in that space, and they revel in the distortionary truths that are in that material. They're not trying to shape the medium. They're letting the medium shape what they produce. And I think through this kind of experimentation, they help us discover new things, genuinely new things. And they let that work sort of guide them, and they find the grain in the technology, and they let it guide them. And I think this is where the real provocative change is going to come from, those kinds of people. They're the people that are going to change what AI is and what it really means and what it does to society. And I think if we're all willing to collectively lean in to the true grain of that technology, who knows, we might discover the next rock and roll. So thank you.